Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. Don't go to the ghost town inn. One late summer day, my old Uncle Greg called to tell me his sister had suffered from cardiac arrest. The news of my aunt's passing would send me off on a cross-country road trip while my wife stayed home to look after the dog and cats. Sarah protested at first, saying she wanted to be there for emotional support. But this wasn't my first funeral procession, and truth be told, I was never close to my aunt. I was just going to be there for Greg. So after convincing Sarah to just stay home and spend the week relaxing, I was off on my road trip. Little did I know what I'd be getting into. My first day cruising the interstate went off without a hitch. Despite the sullen nature of the journey, getting out and seeing the open countryside of multiple different states made my spirit feel lightweight and free of life's day-to-day grind. I'd end the first day by pulling into a cozy little town, stopping at a small mom-and-pop diner before checking in at a nearby motel. Day 2 seemed a little more hectic. Waking up late, I rushed out of the hotel and hit the road. Opting to skip breakfast entirely, I spent the better half of 8 hours driving 10 over the speed limit, stopping only to get gas. Sleeping in had put me 4 hours behind schedule, and come nightfall, I found myself on a long stretch of highway snaking through mountainous woodlands. My eyes drifted between the road and the digital clock on the dashboard. After 12 straight hours of driving, I was cursing under my breath and looking for anywhere to stop for the night. When the woods surrounding the highway became so thick that it began to block out the natural moonlight, I sighed and came to the conclusion I might be pulling over to sleep in my car. To my surprise, a sign popped up, indicating an exit for a town. Twines Grove, population 700. All the tension left my body, and in an instant I became more relaxed. The exit took me down a winding canyon road, made unnerving by the lack of guardrails and low-hanging tree branches that seemed to reach out for my windshield. Finally, it dumped off into a flat, forested area, which I thought vacant at first. After a moment of driving, I noticed the houses buried deep in the tree lane. The driveways leading to the houses were gravel and well hidden between the trees. From what I could make out with the brief passing of my car's headlights, the houses appeared quite old, weathered and worn down. One sat closer to the road, and I could clearly see the doors and windows boarded up. I had been driving through this town for all but 5 minutes, and already it was creeping me out. Just when I began to consider turning around, the dull glow of a gas station appeared in the distance. Knowing I'd need to fuel up to reach the next major town, I decided to pull in alongside one of the pumps. Figured I'd ask the clerk inside if there were any places I could stay for the night while I was there. I stepped out of my car, embracing the unusually cold air which sent shivers down my spine. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my wallet only to realize the pumps were so old that they didn't take any form of card payment. Shrugging it off, I walked into the store, only to find it empty. Literally empty. The entire building was just an open room, no shelves or freezers for storing goods. A gross checkered tile with numerous stains and cracks dominated the room, accentuated by a flickering light in the back right corner. I stared at the surreal and vacant store in front of me, only snapping back to reality when I saw a roach scurrying across the floor. Feeling thoroughly unnerved by the situation, I returned to my car and contemplated my next move. It was damn near midnight now, and I needed to get some shut-eye. Against my better judgment, I pulled out of the parking lot and headed further up the road. Not even a mile up the road, an old wooden sign came up for a roadside inn. With crossed fingers, I pulled into the lot. My headlights illuminated a two-story log cabin-style cottage nestled between thickets of trees. Moss or ivy appeared to be growing on the outer walls, and all of the windows were dark except for one, which had a faint glow. An uneasy feeling washed over me once I turned the car off. I spent another minute debating if I really wanted to approach that building, which didn't have a single source of light besides the faint glow from the first-floor window. Stepping out into the night air, it immediately struck me how eerily silent my surroundings seemed to be. After many camping trips in the mountains and forests, I had grown accustomed to the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness. Owls, crickets, the call of coyotes or foxes. The area around this cabin was dead quiet. Not even the slightest rustling of trees or bushes could be heard. Listening to my own footsteps while approaching the inn made the very hairs on my back stand up. The door to the cabin had an old, rusting metal sign which read, "Open," nailed above the door handle. I spent another few seconds just staring at the sign, wondering if I should knock or just step inside. Out of nowhere, a rush of hot air ran down my neck with a distinct sensation which can only be described as someone standing right behind me and letting out a deep breath. I spun around, heart now racing from what I just felt, but nobody was there. Chalking it up to a lack of sleep, I turned around and nearly screamed when the face of an old man stood just inches away. He somehow managed to open the door and positioned himself in the doorway without making even the slightest sound. The man wore brown dress pants and a brown tweed jacket. Wrinkles lined his scowling face, which sat under a messy mop of scraggly gray hair. "What are you doing out this time of night?" His voice barked in the silence of the night, filled with rasp and old age. Holding my still beating heart, I drew in a deep breath and closed my eyes. "Looking for a place to stay for the night, sir." His eyes narrowed, nearly hiding his hazy green irises. After turning and grumbling, the old man gestured me to follow him inside. "Only one vacant room, top floor. It's $50 a night." We walked into a dim lobby, lit by candles and decorated with antiques from a bygone time. The old man stepped behind a counter which held various dusty books and old glass bottles. I pulled out my wallet and offered him my card. He took it, shaking his head and letting out a sigh. "Only take cash, son. But I tell you what, you can stay fair tonight and pay me back later." He handed my card back and reached down under the desk to grab an old brass key. A grateful smile fell upon my face. "Man, I can't thank you enough," I dashed. Before I could finish, he cut me off. No need to thank me. It's been a good while since I've had a guest come to stay." He paused, leaned in, and displayed a crooked smile. "I'm happy to accommodate you, son. Take a candle here to light your way." Standing there somewhat speechless, I grabbed the key from him along with one of the candles. I looked down and saw the room number etched into the face of the key. Room 13. The old man continued to show his unflattering smile as I nodded my head and turned to the hallway. Against the dim glow of candlelight, I saw a row of vintage photographs lining the wall. The people in them were dressed from the Victorian era. Walking down the old creaking floorboards, I saw the hallway split into two paths. On the right was the staircase to the second floor. To the left sat the intersection of another hallway, with the vague outline of a deer head mounted on the wall. I stared at that mounted head as I approached the staircase, unnerved by the frightened expression it wore on its frozen dead face. Just when I began to climb the flight of stairs, I saw that fucking deer head move in the peripheral of my vision. Frozen on the steps, I slowly turned around and peeked over the low wall which separated the hallway divide. The deer head looked straight on down the hall, a vacant stare in its beady eyes. "Okay, I'm really fucking tired. I need to get some sleep," I whispered. Making my way to the top of the staircase, I tiptoed through the halls looking for room 13, all while keeping my head on a swivel. My room ended up being at the very back of the hallway. Slotting the key into the doorknob, I stopped and turned around when I heard something behind me. It sounded like a group of people whispering something unintelligible, just out of earshot. But there wasn't anything there in the hallway behind me, just those vintage photographs sitting above burgundy carpets on brown floral wallpaper. Shaking my head, I quickly unlocked the door and pushed my way inside. The room I stepped into seemed cramped. A double bed with a wooden frame sat against the wall, facing a lone window which revealed only tree branches on the other side. 2 end tables accompanied the bed on each side, with a small attached bathroom at the foot of the bed. That was the extent of the room, but I didn't spend any time thinking or complaining about the dimensions. Setting the candle down on the end table, I tucked myself in and closed my eyes. Sleep did not come. Almost in an act of defiance, the room became unsettling and noisy the moment I closed my eyes. Branches hit the wall outside the window. Creaks from the floorboards echoed beyond the closed door, and a faint scratching sound emanated from the bathroom. Completely frustrated, I got up to investigate the scratching sound, but found nothing. The sound disappeared the moment I stepped foot into the bathroom, only to flare up again when I laid back down. Soon, even the sound of the candle became unbearable, keeping me awake with the crackling and burning wick. In a fit of irrational thinking, I blew out the candle and tucked my head between 2 pillows. A cold chill then swept over me, and I opened my eyes. That's when I saw it. Perched on the ceiling, obscured by shadows of the night, was a distorted human face. Frozen in fear, I sat there and watched this face as it slowly moved across the ceiling, shifting its facial expressions in horrifying and inhuman ways. The thing looked like it was in constant agony. Once it hovered directly above me, I heard faint whispering coming from its mouth, the very same whispering I heard in the hallway earlier. Ice ran through my veins when the shadowy face began to descend from the ceiling, heading right for me. Taking control of my body, I let out a piercing scream and jolted out of bed. Crashing through the door, I ran down the hallway. Time slowed as my heart blasted in my chest. Hundreds of those faces began materializing in the very walls, slowly floating out in my direction. No, 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 no. Fuck this. Fuck all of this. It can't be real. My screams only seemed to anger the shadow entities, which now lunged out of the walls with glowing red eyes. Making a sharp turn, I bolted down the staircase, my feet crashing down loudly with each step. When I reached the bottom, I froze in horror. Blocking the hallway ahead stood a shadow figure 10 feet tall. It had a rotting deer skull for a head with piercing red eyes. Horrible demonic whispering radiated from the creature as it lurched forward. Booking it back up the staircase, I ran down the hallway opposite of room 13 until I hit a dead end with a single window. Turning to see that fucking Wendigo-esque beast hot on my trail, I made the decision to jump out of the fucking window. I landed hard into a thick blanket of bushes below, twisting my ankle in the process. Quickly getting to my feet, I hopped out of the bushes and looked up at the window. A pair of red eyes locked with mine, no body to be seen. The eyes slowly backed off and disappeared into the darkness. Frantic, I ran through the thick foliage and back into the parking lot, where I thanked God to see and sit in my car. I booked it out of that town and drove all night back up the highway until sunrise. Greg said I looked like mold over shit when I arrived for the funeral, and I wasn't able to offer the emotional support I wanted to give him. I took a different route entirely on the way back home, never even wanting to see the sign for that God-forsaken town again. The thing that bothers me, though, is that when I go back to look on Google Maps, Twinsgrove isn't there. Doesn't even show up on old paper maps. Where the fuck did I go that night? Second story. My girlfriend took me camping. I just want to start by saying that dating is hard. Once you get past all the bots, ads, and scammers and meet a real person. The guessing game begins. Why is this person actually available right now? Are they really just down on their luck? Or is it something else that you're happier not knowing? Then, once you figure out their deep dark secrets, the question becomes, are they willing to put up with your deep dark secrets? This process can take weeks to sort out, usually resulting in a dead end somewhere, forcing you to start over. The whole thing is frustrating, demeaning, and humiliating enough that you're physically and emotionally exhausted, making you just want to give up and be a loner. Now I know what you're wondering. What's this got to do with anything? Well, it's kinda simple. A little bit ago, I wrote about how my girlfriend, Wendy, never eats and that I heard some unsettling things at her house the last time I visited. Well, I decided to keep seeing Wendy. Sure, she might have some unusual habits, but she makes me feel good about myself, and I'm happy with her. So what if she never eats or chases off bears while nude in the middle of the night? Compared to returning to the dating scene, that's really not so bad. We even have nicknames for each other now, country girl and city boy. I'll let you guess which is which. Anyway, that's a rather long and roundabout way of saying that. Yeah, I went on that camping trip with her, and things didn't go quite how I expected. First off, I want to say that she was right. The forest really is beautiful. The sun's heat, combined with the coolness of the shade, while listening to the insects drone lazily in the background, seems to slow time to a crawl, making each breath a relaxing experience in and of itself. It's entirely unlike anything you'll experience during your morning commute. Combine all that with the right company, and soon you'll wonder why you'd ever return. And let me tell you, Wendy is 100% the right company. Wendy was quick with tips to make the hike easier, from how to properly distribute your pack load to how to lace your shoes for maximum comfort. During the trek to where we were going to set up camp, she alternated between offering interesting bits of information about the local flora and fauna and walking in silence, allowing me to get lost in the experience. The whole affair made me want to give up the city life and move to the country. There was just one thing during the walk that wasn't as pleasant as everything else. At one point, we must have walked too close to a skunk or a rotting carcass or something because the whole area around us started to reek. At first, it wasn't so bad, but eventually it got so strong it made me want to gag. I jokingly mentioned it to Wendy, but she just looked ahead like she was determined and told me, "Pick up the pace. We'll be past it soon enough." Sure enough, we eventually got past the smell, and things quickly became pleasant again. The rest of the hike passed without incident, and Wendy even helped me set up the tent. Her evident experience in the matter showed through because it took no time. Soon enough, everything was ready, and we even had a nice, cheerful fire roaring. This time, when she pulled out the supplies for dinner, I didn't even bat an eye when it was clearly only enough for one. Whatever was going on with her, this was just the way it was going to be. It was up to me to accept that or move on, and I'd made my call. But I have to say, for someone who never seems to eat, she sure knows how to sear a steak to perfection. After a pleasant evening and an even more pleasant night, we passed out in the tent together while listening to the crickets and the more distant owls. But of course, if that's all that happened, I wouldn't be writing about it here. Sometime during the night, I awoke to find I was alone in the tent. This wasn't too unexpected because Wendy was both an outdoor enthusiast and a bit of a night owl. I debated calling out to her, but something in the air felt like I shouldn't disturb it with such an out-of-place sound. However, Mother Nature did have her demands, and it was time to answer her call. As I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I couldn't help but look up into the night sky. The stars were breathtaking. You never see this many this vibrant in the city. However, their beauty couldn't distract me for long in the face of more urgent demands. Do you know that feeling when you've been holding it in a little too long and finally experience relief? If it weren't for my experiences earlier that night, I might be tempted to claim it is better than sex, but we'll just say it was still pretty euphoric. Maybe it distracted me from the fact that all the usual night sounds had suddenly gone quiet, but it couldn't distract me from the sudden smell of rotting flesh. It was even stronger than it had been on the trail and was accompanied by the kind of fear that you usually feel when you're very young and just starting to wonder if there might be reasons sounds go bump in the night. I gagged as I struggled to cut off the stream, zip up my pants, and retreat into the tent again. Once in the tent, I reached for the flashlight, then hesitated. I desperately wanted to see better, but something in the back of my mind told me it was better to remain hidden. Of course, I don't know how well hidden a blue tent in the middle of the forest can be, but turning on a flashlight would be like activating a beacon for everything within a few miles to see. I sat in the dark for I don't know how long, feeling my heart pound through my chest loud enough that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it clearly. Thankfully, the smell eventually faded, but I was still so high on adrenaline that I knew I wouldn't sleep another wink for the rest of the night. Or so I thought. The following day, I awoke with Wendy cuddled in my arm, with one of her legs and arms draped over me, and once again, she was totally nude. Now, I was pretty sure she'd put on some pajamas before going to bed, but as she stirred and I got a good look at what was on display, I suddenly didn't care all that much. Eventually, she smiled lazily up at me and spoke. "You sleep all right, city boy? You seem to have some pretty rough dreams in the middle of the night." At the time, those words made perfect sense. In the light of day, it seemed pretty clear that whatever happened last night was probably just a vivid dream brought on by the experiences of the day before and an unfamiliar environment. After a bit more time together, we decided to get up and tackle another day in the forest. However, when I finally crawled out of the tent, I could see OU. Our entire camp was in disarray. It was like something had gone through and tossed everything around. A few of the more delicate items were totally demolished. After a moment, I called out, Hey, you might want to take a look at this." As Wendy crawled out of the tent, she made a face. Must have been a bear. They usually don't come out this way, so I wasn't too worried about them. I guess that's on me, sorry. A bear, that kind of made sense. At least, I told myself so. As we were cleaning up, I even saw tracks, though, in my inexperience as a city boy, I would have said they belonged to a dog, not a bear. A huge dog. Maybe a wolf? What was even odder was when I found what looked like hoof prints. Looking at the prints, I realized that deer must be much bigger than they look on TV since they were more than twice as long as my hand. There isn't much more to say about the day. We fixed the place up, had breakfast, went on a hike, made dinner, and called it a night, with a few other minor activities sprinkled throughout. I was back to enjoying the trip, so much so that I had mostly forgotten about the night before. But that night is when things took a bit of an unexpected turn. Once again, I awoke in the middle of the night. Thankfully, I wasn't alone this time, as Winnie was still asleep, half on top of me again. However, that stench was back and stronger than ever. It was amazing how bright it seemed in the tent. It must have been a full moon, or at least nearly full, because I could clearly see the shadow of a large deer pass between us and the night sky. But there was something wrong with this deer. It was clearly too tall, as if it was standing on hind legs, and when it opened its mouth, I could even make out a mouthful of very sharp teeth. I couldn't help it. I felt myself breathing more heavily by the second as my heart rate skyrocketed. My mind went blank when I suddenly felt Wendy stir. Remembering the presence of my considerably smaller girlfriend, I suddenly felt protective, as if I couldn't let anything happen to her. I was just about to tell her to be quiet when I noticed her looking up at me with a finger on her lips as if telling me to do the same. Then she whispered to me, "Stay in the tent," and started to get up. I don't know what I was thinking or if I was thinking. All I knew was I couldn't let Wendy go out to face whatever that was, so I reached out and grabbed her wrist before she could exit the tent. However, when she looked back at me, I released her immediately, almost as scared of her as whatever was outside the tent. Her eyes reflected light back at me like a cat's, and I could see the nails on her hand growing as I watched. In half a moment, she turned back around, opened the tent, and climbed outside. I will never forget the sound I heard at that moment. After I got home, I looked up the calls of a bunch of wild animals, and in hindsight, I'd say it was like a compilation of an elk call, a rabbit scream, and a mountain lion scream, but impossibly loud. Wendy shouted in answer, her tiny human voice sounding so frail in comparison. At least it did until it started to change, morphing and twisting into the howl of an impossibly large wolf. I couldn't help it. I peeked out the tent flap, and standing in front of the tent was what I could only describe as a werewolf. The little 5 foot and change Wendy was now standing at least 7 feet tall, covered in fur with claws and fangs that looked like they could tear through steel, and she looked ready for murder. Then, some movement on the opposite end of our camp drew my attention, and I witnessed a living nightmare that suddenly made a werewolf seem like less of a problem. It looked kind of like a deer if a deer had more articulated limbs far too long for its body. The feet ended in hooves, but the hands ended in long bony claws. The whole thing looked desiccated, its skin drawn so tight over its ribs and arms you could make out the skeleton beneath. The fur was spotty and looked partially rotted, with open holes leaking bodily fluids that should never see light. Its teeth were long and serrated, clearly meant for tearing rather than chewing. I sometimes hear hunters talking about deer being 8 or 10 points, but if I had to estimate, this thing had a 30-point antler, with many of the tines covered in what I suspected to be dried viscera from previous victims. The two monsters charged each other. The nightmare, which I now know was a Wendigo, lowered its head, intending to impale its opponent, but at the last second, Wendy threw herself nearly flat on the ground, only to rocket up into the Wendigo, latching onto its long neck with her powerful jaws while her hind feet kicked gouges into its vulnerable stomach. However, the Wendigo didn't seem willing to give up that easily and tossed Wendy aside. She hit the ground hard and was soon set upon by the other monster. She raised an arm to defend herself, only for the Wendigo to latch on with its own teeth, easily tearing through her skin and muscles. With a powerful kick, Wendy pushed the nightmare back, then started swiping at him over and over, making it lose ground. However, lowering its head, the Wendigo charged forward again, and this time, Wendy wasn't fast enough as the Wendigo caught her on his antlers and flipped her over his back, with new blood darkening the tips of the tines. But that was its downfall as Wendy sprung up and again latched onto its neck with her teeth, this time from behind. The nightmare struggled in vain, occasionally raking Wendy with his claws, but she refused to let go and began ripping and tearing her way through its neck until she grabbed hold of its antlers, and with one final jerk, the head came free. I don't have the heart to describe what came next, but let's just say the sound of flesh being torn and eaten is much more distinct through the thin membrane of a tent than a closed cabin window. Time passed. At least an hour, maybe 2 or 3. It's hard to say for sure. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Maybe I was going to be next, or perhaps I'd wake up from this nightmare. But eventually, the adrenaline passed, my eyes grew heavy, and I fell asleep again. When I awoke in the morning, I was alone this time. There was no sign Wendy had come back. I'd half hoped she'd still be here, telling me I'd had another nightmare, but I don't think I would have believed it again. It was kind of sad and lonely packing up our things by myself. I debated bringing Wendy's stuff with me, but I'm not that good of a hiker and wasn't confident I could pull it off, so I just left her things in her pack inside the tent. When I exited the tent, I was more than a little surprised to see Wendy sitting calmly by the fire pit with no wounds in sight. She smiled sadly. "So, I guess I owe you an explanation." I remember hesitating, my mind blank, before I settled on the thought I had earlier. "What? You're not going to try and convince me it was a nightmare again?" She looked around at all the destruction in the campsite. Earth was kicked up, trees had claw marks gouged out, and there were signs of blood splatter everywhere. "I didn't think I could convince you this time." I nodded as I looked around. "Yeah, I guess not." Then I looked back at her. "You know, for a bit there, I was starting to think you were the monster eating people out here." Wendy pointed at herself, then laughed. "Wait, me? Wendy the Wendigo? Don't you think that's a little too on the nose?" I couldn't help it. As weird and messed up as everything was, as disturbing as everything I learned was, this was the Wendy I knew and cared for. So, I laughed with her. "Yeah, maybe so." Long story short, we're still together. Sure, my girlfriend might be a 7-foot-tall monster that eats other monsters for fun, but everyone has their quirks. Besides, dating is hard, and I'm happy where I am. Third story. What lurks beneath the surface of Saskatchewan? Ever wonder what is in the earth? Most would think of the worms and bugs that crawl around in the soil. Others would think of the many dead, man or not, that took their last breath before coming part of the earth again. Some would imagine the burrows made by animals like rabbits or badgers to provide shelter. A few would think of the hot rock deep below, ever so churning. For me, the earth below us is a place for something else entirely. I shudder to remember all of my experience, but I had to so that it is out there, as a warning to others if they were to experience a similar situation. For most of my life, I have lived in a hamlet in Saskatchewan. I will not tell its name as I do not want anyone to experience what I had experienced, but I will try to put context so that it makes sense to anyone who would be in a similar situation to mine. The hamlet was at one time a town, relying on the railway to provide for its residents and businesses. It was that way until a fire in the early 1920s that destroyed half the town. I do not know how many people died in the fire, however. What is known is that the hamlet never got to its former glory. The only people who lived there were either the religious Mennonites or people who wanted a simpler life. I was part of those who wanted a simpler life, of which I grew up here since I was still an infant since my parents moved from the city of Saskatchewan. While I do have a few fond memories, all that I did is do chores and watch TV, while also going to school in another town a few miles from here. We don't farm, unlike those outside of the hamlet. We are more like one of those people whose parents had worked somewhere else. Overall, in this hamlet, almost everyone knew who everybody was, except for me. During my free time, I would read a few nonfiction books and draw maps that would pop out in my antisocial teenage head. In summer, I would go outside and explore the natural world and the hamlet itself. The weird thing I should mention is that our house is the only one of 2 surviving structures that survived the fire, which is an achievement in itself. The other is an abandoned brick 3-story schoolhouse a block away to the south. It is built in the mid-1910s and abandoned sometime in the 70s, maybe because of a lack of funding to keep operations going. It was bought out by many owners, people like us, but wanted their life to be a little more grandiose. But every time, they would either move out or disappear without a trace. We always assumed the ones gone likely moved out without any of us knowing. I was no different. I used to think that the reason they moved out is because it is difficult to maintain, at least cost-wise. I have heard that water, heating, and plumbing are the main problems, at least what I thought. I would occasionally hear, at least, the bells going off from the schoolhouse, most times when it was supposedly unoccupied. I thought it was the Mennonite kids sneaking into the building to cause a bit of grief upon the town. How wrong I was. It all began during a snowstorm, of which I was sleeping in my bedroom. It was very cold, as we had been struggling with water heating at the time, so I tried to stay warm using hand warmers, which I am not supposed to use under this circumstance, but there is really no other way. I was in a shallow sleep until I heard something amongst the howls of the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind until I strained my ears to listen closer. I could recognize a scream, not the one you would find in horror movies when someone is being killed, but rather an animal in agony, like a cow or something. Usually, if this was the case, coyotes would be yapping around, attacking the animal and sound off their victory cries. Instead, there was nothing else other than those sounds and the near-deafening wind. I think it lasted for a few minutes before it stopped. The next morning, there was no school, but that was the least of my concerns. One of our farmer friends, Bob, called my mother to say he was missing a few cattle from his pasture, which is on the other side of my house, across the gravel road. He did come over and asked us, along with our buddies, to try and look for the cattle, dead or not. The fresh snow, however, would make this task difficult as the remains of the cattle would be buried in the big snow drifts formed from last night. Eventually, we did find one of the cattle. The dead cow itself was found in one of those islands of trees that pop along the emptiness of the snowy plains, protected from the wind so snow does not accumulate much. The mere sight of it made me feel so weak I wanted to just fall, and, as far as I could recall, one or two of the others fell sick once they saw the sight of the carnage. The thing that bothers me about the snow-covered carcass is that it looked so unrecognizable that you would think that it was a long-abandoned deer carcass, with flesh being ripped from the bones and a leg a far distance away. The only way Bob could have known that it was one of his cows was a tag, still attached to the head that is a good distance away from the body. When we found it, it was positioned perfectly on a stump, as if somebody placed it on the stump to relay some strange warning. It also seemingly had its eyes gouged out and tongue ripped out, like the head that was violently torn from the body. We were disturbed by the sight of such ruin. We assumed only a poacher could do this. The sight left us with many questions, and any known evidence we could have found would be buried in snow, and we still have a few missing cattle to find. Bob reported to the police, which they arrived there a while later. Even they were baffled by the sight of it when it led to it, but they chalked it up to some wild animal attack, explaining a bear could do this. Bob wasn't happy with the explanation, pointing to the perfectly placed head on the stump as a counterpoint that a poacher killed the cow rather than some bear. Either way, the police did warn us to look out for any dangerous animals in the area, and Bob cleaned up the remains. Me and my mother returned home only to talk about the sight we saw. I did not sleep well after that. I always felt watched while I slept, as if there was a presence looking at me through the window. Every time I looked, there was nothing there at the window. At the same time, I would also hear sounds coming from the roof of our house, but I chalked it up to be the few feral cats that usually climb the trees and live on the roof. Over the next few days, I noticed a decreasing number of cats. At first, I wouldn't notice since we usually feed the cats outdoors and any cats missing would reappear. It seems those we do not see stay unseen. We worry something might be happening to them, like a pack of coyotes or even someone feeding them windshield fluid, but we do not see the bodies. I counted at least 6 of them gone, likely more. That was until 5 days after the cow killing when something came up. In between our house and the schoolhouse is the villa, or a place where the old go to be taken care of. The reason for the villa to be there is, at least what I thought, simply down to the fact the elders wanted a simpler life, like the rest of us, Mennonite or not, for the rest of their days. Today, however, things are getting more complicated than anyone could handle. As far as I heard, on that morning, one of the people there walked down the driveway at the villa and saw something red around the tree. He went closer and realized that there are objects around the tree within the red-stained snow. The man noticed something terribly wrong with what he is seeing. What he was seeing is 7 poorly severed heads of cats within blood-stained snow, and he looked up to see their torn bodies hanging in the bare tree branches. He turned to call out the others on this grisly spectacle, and more people surrounded the tree. Even the neighboring Mennonites went to see the sight, only to recoil at the mere sight of it. The police eventually arrived, and this time they cleaned up the scene, leaving behind a tree surrounded by blood-stained snow. This was told to me by Barney, one of our neighbors who went to the scene. He stated that he thinks somebody is killing the animals for the fun of it, while also thinking this is somehow connected to the missing cows. I was struggling to comprehend who or what is doing this or the actual reason behind this. I went outside to look at the blood-soaked snow that moats around the tree. As I looked from the entrance to the villa, I started to think the cats weren't killed by the tree, as there was seemingly no sign of a struggle in the snow. It looked like the cats were placed there, as there were no splashes around the pool. I tried to look for tracks, but what would be left of it seems to be trampled by the many footsteps of those who visited. As I was walking back to my house, I heard someone yell out something from a distance away. I turned to see a middle-aged man, dressed in jeans and a plaid-button shirt with a coat, walking sternly towards me in the road. I recognized as one of the neighbors, but he looked like he was mad or something. I was looking on in a confused stance as he walked up to me, grabbed me by my sweater, and angrily told something in his angry twang that the devil has come to town. I was held up for a few seconds until Bob broke it up and argued with the guy. Eventually, he walked away, and Bob assured me everything is going to be okay. That is not where it ends. Strange remains of animals are still being reported, and each more bizarre. In another area nearby, at another of those tree islands, somebody found a site of a pile of dismembered coyote corpses. To the north, there was also a report of 3 dead horses, whose bodies are torn up. The heads were missing until they were found nearby in a triangle configuration, disturbing those who saw the sight. Ever since that, more animals in the area disappeared. It even got so bad people won't let their pets alone in fear they may go missing. Police began to think that a few sick individuals are involved. However, the only proof is the crime done. By this point, no one knew who the suspects are. That was until one night. When I was trying to sleep in my room, I heard a tapping through the window that is facing towards the pasture. I thought it was a branch tapping on the window, so I looked up. At first, I confirmed by belief that it was a branch. That was, until it moved in a way a branch wouldn't, and what seems to be more of those branches appeared. The branches are fingers. Fingers long and emaciated, ending in long claws. The fingers followed up to a hand that looked almost human. Imagine holding out your hand and try to make your index finger do the same function as the thumb. The only way to do that is to put the index finger nearer to the thumb itself. That is the hand I saw. The size of the palm took roughly less than a quarter of the 2-foot by 2-foot window. As the hand reached down, I could see it was connected to an arm that is in similar condition to the fingers. After a few moments, the hand suddenly shot up in a split second and the banging of the roof began, only to last a mere few seconds. After that, my mother rushed down the stairs to shut the door open, asking if I was okay. By this point, I was frozen in place in shock. She asked if I heard the noises from the roof. All I could muster is a nod. The next day, I evaluated my experience and asked my mother what it was she heard, knowing the answer. Instead, she explained to me that, when she was trying to sleep in her room upstairs, when she looked through her window, she swore she saw an eye. It wasn't human, but rather like a goat's, and what was its hairless face taking over half of her similarly sized window. She stayed still for a few moments until it seemed to see light coming from the north and was gone in a split second. During this movement, she thought she caught sight of its bunny-like ears, and the noises began, but gone as they began. I then told her about my experience, and we were in agreement that we saw the same creature. We also agreed to not tell anyone about the experience, as telling anyone this seemingly ridiculous story would make us look crazy. The animal disappearances continued, but declined a little, maybe because more people are keeping their pets inside. Eventually, they stopped once spring came along, and we all thought it was the end of it. People are letting their dogs and cats out, not giving a worry about them. The farmers no longer had to monitor the cattle, as not only they had to worry about the events happening, but there were less predators at the time. There was a period of relief until it got worse. It happened sometime in the late part of spring. As far as I heard, one of our farmer friends, Nathan, came over to another of his buddies' place, Howard. Both lived nearby. He knocked on the door of the house, expecting a welcome from him as usual. Instead, there is no answer at the door. He kept knocking, assuming he was asleep or something. He eventually called him and heard his phone from inside. He was hoping for a response. There was none. Nathan became concerned, assumed that he had a heart attack or he was dead, so he tried to find a way in. He looked around the house, crowbar in hand, trying to look for a window low enough to open. He found none, so he got through the door and went in. As he walked up the stairs and into the first floor, he saw there was nothing wrong. Everything seems to be in place until he went to the bedroom where Howard is supposed to be. When he opened the door, the place was a mess. Bed sheets were everywhere. Drawers have fallen down, broken glass, and, oddly enough, the bed that is upside down near a broken window. He could see the phone near the bed, broken but working. He called the police to report this, and they did an investigation once they arrived. That is at least what I was told. Either way, Howard was missing. Howard wasn't the only one missing, however. He was the start of a series of odd disappearances that continued all the way through summer. It ranges from the usual, like a hiker going missing, to the bizarre, an entire family disappearing from a home without any reason. I think I counted at least 15 missing throughout. What makes this more unusual is the supposed perpetrators seem to never leave a trace, other than the damage they leave behind, from broken windows to smashed-in doors. The police were confused, trying to find every suspect possible. To some, it seems like the same people who killed the cats and took their pets are starting to take the people. Others find it really unexplainable and scary, so they took the effort to not go alone outside at night, fearing they may become missing. It went so far as to hunting parties looking for the group responsible, and, still, they happened. Animals began disappearing again, albeit at a lesser rate. People still kept their pets inside, and farmers began to monitor their cattle again. It was a risky time. Nothing is safe once the sun goes down. All that was my summer break was staying inside most of the time, playing games with my mother and drawing fictionalized maps. I then remembered the night that I saw the hand, and I at least thought it was connected to the disappearances. I then looked on the internet for anything that described the creature. The closest thing I found to the description of this thing is the Wendigo, who you all know, with the skinwalker a close second. Wendigo, however, are still somewhat human and don't have bunny ears, nor does a skinwalker turn into a hairless abomination we saw on that night. I looked harder, finding no luck on it, until I found something unexpected. I can't remember the site, but it had to do something with Cree legends in the area, of which included the Wendigo, just under Wetiko. What I read was different from the story of the Wendigo. It had to do with the mythology of the moon rabbit, who wished to ride it one day and asked Crane to take him to the moon. Along the way, his hand is somehow bleeding and marked it on Crane's head, explaining the red mark on every Crane's head today. What it did not tell, at least according to the site, is that the moon rabbit had a brother. As the story goes, they wanted to ride the moon together and they asked Crane to carry them up there, but Crane could only carry one at the time. The moon rabbit was being carried by Crane when his brother jumped and tried to grab upon his paws, only to scratch them and fall back down. Stuck on the ground, he could only watch as his sibling went up towards the moon. The winter air came, and he went into his burrow to sleep. He woke up early, figuring the snow would be gone. The snow is gone, but the plants haven't turned green, so he tried to start a fire. The fire then spread, forcing him into his burrow and waiting until it died itself off. When he came out, there was no food in sight, and so he starved, thinning each day and losing his hair. One day, a deer arrived and, in sheer desperation, killed the deer to savor his hunger. On and on, every animal he saw he killed and ate, but he wasn't satisfied. Even when the grass returned, he was still accustomed to eating the flesh of others, only hunting at night to see his brother, riding the moon and hoping to come. Man then arrived and, unlike him, only killed when they needed to. The hungry rabbit contorted himself to be more man-like to be with man, only for them to be revolted by its horrific stature. Angry, he killed the whole tribe and ate them. The other tribes, hearing of this, descended upon the land he resided, burning the land so there was nothing for him. This did not stop it, going as far to kill the tribes who set fire to its land. The tribes who remained were forced to offer their own to satisfy the beast. Wesakchek, trickster hero to the Cree, saw this and thought out a plan to stop it. One night, while the beast was hunting, he turned into the moon rabbit and spoke to him. Surprised, the hungry thing told him how sorry he was for scratching his paw and asked him if he could go to the moon with him. Wesakchek, in the moon rabbit form, told him he couldn't go as he killed others to only satisfy himself. The beast then noticed that he did not have any scratches on his paw, so it called out Wesakchek and chased him, falling into his own burrow in the process. The other tribesmen then put a heavy rock over the burrow, trapping it. It is unknown whether the beast starved to death or was just sleeping, but one thing is certain, the rock should remain sealed. Now, I do not know if this was a real Cree myth, as other websites never mention this mythology, but it shares some similarities with the creature I saw. The contorted human-like rabbit form, the disappearances, matched in my mind. I still have one more question left to answer, as to where the burrow of the creature is. I began to research the reports of missing animals and people. What I have found is a trend. The disappearances themselves tend to increase in frequency once it is at least during the appearance of the half-moon phase, at its greatest frequency during the full moon phase, and goes silent once the other half-moon phase passes. As for the killings, they only seem to occur during a full moon. As for the distribution of these occurrences, the furthest one out is about some 18 miles from here at some park near a lake. From there, they seem to get more frequent the nearer they are to my hamlet. It seems whatever is responsible for the occurrences is somewhere at the hamlet. The question is, where in the hamlet would it be? That is another time. For then on, the occurrences continued, until early fall when things changed. During one night, on a nearly full moon only covered by clouds, a couple were driving down the single-laned highway that provides access to my hamlet. They were talking until they narrowly hit a deer that was running from the hamlet's side. They stopped in shock as a herd of deer ran across the road. As the last deer began to cross the road, something snatched it from view. All they could hear is the screaming agony of the deer until, like a switch, silence took over again. For a few moments, it was simply silence, until they heard some sort of voice coming from where the deer was snatched. The voice sounded as if something was trying to make words, but missing a lot of the stresses that make a proper human speech possible, resulting in a gargling mess of sounds. As they were hearing the voices, they got closer until they spotted what seems to be a tube of some kind hitting the road. Based on their accounts, this tube that had some sort of appendages at the bottom was about 8 feet tall, thick as a tree trunk, was all they could see in their headlights. They said it was possible the tube was connected to something out of view of the light. All of a sudden, they heard a thump on the roof, and the voices turned into a deep, primal crackling of whatever creature had such legs. They then sped around the tube, which they figured by now a leg of the threatening creature that made those sounds. They went a few miles away until they felt safe from the thing. They eventually got out, only to find blood on their roof. They later called the police, of which the police suspected the couple made the story up to cover the fact they hit the deer. When the police went to where they reported the incident, they saw no sign of the dead deer. They charged the couple and went on their way. At least, this is what I heard by word of the others I managed to piece together. The odd thing is the only damage to the vehicle is the roof, where they supposedly heard the thumping sound. This has taken over me, of course, but I had to find a way to stop, to find its lair. I had tried to look for the location of where it could be. I guess I was frantic. It affected my life at school, with grades lowering and not handing in schoolwork on time. I was distracted by this point. As classmates would talk about theories of Wendigos or skinwalkers, I was more interested in the location of the supposed creature. Sometime in the middle of fall, during a clear, cold night, I was in bed, sleeping until I heard something in the distance outside. I sat up in bed and I wasn't sure what it was at first. The longer I listened, the more I am convinced the bells are ringing at the schoolhouse. I found it unusual that someone would ring the bell in the night. Investigating this, I carefully grabbed my shoes and my sweater and came outside, to the middle of the road. Walking towards the schoolhouse, the sound grew louder and louder, constantly ringing until it slowly stopped. I was confused, looking towards the schoolhouse in stark confusion. I had a feeling in my gut that I was being stalked by something, a haunting feeling I still remember to this day. All of a sudden, something hit my head and all went black. I then woke up in a slightly lit area, immediately noticing something wrong with my vision. Touching the area where my right eye should have been, I was instead met with a hollow, and it was becoming apparent as it began to hurt. I reached out to the front of my left eye and noticed blood on my finger. As much as it scares me about a missing eye, that was the least of my concerns as I was looking around to see the area. Where I am at, it is a large cavern, minus the stalactites, basking in a warm light coming from my right and smells of rotting meat. When I looked down, I was shocked in horror as I saw the wretched bodies of many animals. It is hard to remember this. The trauma it had caused me was permanent, but I'll try to describe what I did to get out of there. I was looking around, frozen like a deer in headlights, at the many corpses that lay in this cave. I then shook it out, remembering that I had to escape this hell. I carefully moved over the corpses, trying not to step on them and aware something could still be in the cave. Eventually moving to a clear enough path, I moved to where the light came from. I noticed that the orange light flickers. Getting closer, I realized it was a fire going, a relatively large one. Missing an eye puts me at a disadvantage, as anything to my right would be blocked by my nose. Also, it was bleeding, feeling the streams coming down my face. I needed to get something to cover my wound very quickly. Looking around the fire, I noticed a large pile of clothes at the other side of the fire. Being cautious, I very slowly walked around the fire, still looking around the darkness in an endless, paralyzing fear. Eventually, I got there, but the clothes themselves were mostly dirty and blood-covered. I dug through the clothes, recognizing that they once belonged to somebody. I eventually found a sleeve of a white sweatshirt, so I wrapped it around my head to cover my bleeding socket. I then heard something within the cave in the distance. It prompted me to hide in the clothes, stinking of sweat and mold while seeing through my left eye to an opening. It sounded like scratching and footsteps, getting closer and louder to the fire where I am staring. The scratching then stopped, and the footsteps continued, assuming it was in the cave already. Looking behind the fire, I could see a hairless, pale, small-bodied figure walking around on thin legs and carrying something in its thin arms. As it walked into darkness, I thought I saw its bunny-like ears upon the head of the creature. All of a sudden, it produced a sound that sounded like an angry bull but higher-pitched, almost like a blood-curdling scream of a woman about to die in the horror movies. The thing came out of the darkness. The sight of it will haunt me in my dreams as I saw its face for the first time. It looked like a combination of a rabbit and a human, with a somewhat human-like mouth, a rabbit's nose and eyes that are in proportion when compared to a human. I could tell the eyes are dilated, with large pupils taking up half of its eyes. I could see what seemed to be blood around its mouth as it opened them. The teeth looked like broken glass placed haphazardly all over the inside of its mouth as it gaped unusually wide, nearly reaching to the base of the neck, as it produced that same scream. It seems to be looking all over the place for something, going under the bodies and turning over the bones and screaming. It seems to be angry that I am gone from the body pile it had made. It then went around the fire to crouch down in front of the clothes pile, blocking the light and my view as it reached out with those familiar large hands towards me. The creature then hesitated as there are noises coming from the entrance where it came from. The noises themselves sounded like shouting, but the creature screamed, filtering out the voices. The creature quickly walked towards the same entrance, clawing through the entrance until its sounds were gone. I could hear gunfire coming from the entrance as more footsteps are coming, but more human this time. I then saw Bob and a few other men with flashlights and shotguns running into my view, also searching for me, but for an entirely different reason. As one of the men got close enough to the clothes pile, I reached out my left hand and the man noticed. He then called out the rest of the men to come to me. Bob looked at me shocked, and he picked me up, carrying me while surrounded by the others. As we got to the entrance, the men turned around, shining their flashlights, only for the creature to pop out. The men began shooting it, with some shells hitting the creature and the others at the cave walls. It is affected by them, adding to the collective of bullet holes already in it. This did not slow it down, as it proceeded to grab one of the men and bite off his head, only to toss it aside as it swiped at another of them, throwing him across the cavern. We went between its legs, narrowly escaping the thing as the others are still shooting the thing, with some shells zooming past us. Bob ran and ran through the cave for 10 minutes until we met with the other men. There, a rope ladder is there, going up about 100 feet. A rope then came down as the screams of the creature got closer and closer. Bob proceeded to put me down on a board and wrap the rope around me at the belly, eventually tying me down to the board. I was then pulled up as the others began to shoot down the entrance, towards the hellish thing coming. Some of the men began to climb the ladder and, for a few minutes, I could hear shooting and screaming coming from below. Eventually, I was being dragged out of the entrance by a few others, and that is when I began to be in and out of the blackness. Eventually, the darkness took over and I thought I was dead at the time. I woke up in a hospital bed, within the blue sheets and still missing vision from the right eye, but less blood. I looked around in the white sheet walls when I saw a hand poking out. The curtains opened to reveal my mother. She was crying and came at me for a hug, telling me that she is worried about me. The nurse came in to tell me that, other than the missing eye, I'll recover. They stayed around for a few minutes while we chatted about life at home. Eventually, my mother said her goodbyes and the nurse said she'll return to check on me. After they left, Bob came out, walking towards me to give me a hug. I asked what happened, and he was hesitant, telling me if I am sure that I wanted to hear this. I shook my head in agreement. He told me slowly that he heard of my taking by one of the elders at the villa. The person claimed the creature went to the schoolhouse and somehow squeezed through the windows of the schoolhouse. The elder eventually called Bob to tell him about it. Bob did not believe this at first, but the elder is adamant about it, swearing to God even. He drove to the schoolhouse to find it empty at first. He kicked down the doors of the building and gained access. At first, the room seems perfectly normal, only to notice a hole in the wall. He walked down the stairs behind the busted wall to a stone basement. Within the basement, he saw what seemed to be some kind of stone altar. In front of this stone altar is a big hole, roughly about 10 or 20 feet in diameter. The moment he thought something is wrong was when he saw pools of blood near the entrance. He exited the building to call up his buddies, of which he told them to get flashlights and shotguns. He waited a few minutes until, apparently, a whole army of Mennonites showed up before his buddies, also told by the old man about the creature. They also came with guns and flashlights and even told him he will help him find his friend's daughter and kill the hellish beast. His friends eventually arrived, at first arguing with the Mennonites until they heard the creature's hellish scream. Some became reluctant, but eventually willing to do as there is an army of men there to help, no matter what. As the Mennonites prayed to God for help and the rest prepared, Bob and some of his buddies came down to the basement to figure out a plan. One of them luckily came with the ladder and hooked it up to the altar. They were worried that the ladder may never reach whatever floor lays down the entrance. To their luck, the ladder had enough length to reach the floor and fasten the ropes to the altar. They told the rest that they are ready, and they all loaded up their guns. Their plan is that some of the men would be at the floor of the drop-off while the rest stay up at the surface. A group, led by Bob, would go through the cave to find me. The police were called in the case things got worse. You get what happened next in the cave, but the surface is different. The police did arrive, but they were telling everyone to leave. They even threatened to arrest anyone who don't do what they said. The group were reluctant, as the plan is already set in motion and did not want the plan to go wrong. A confrontation ensued and they argued, until the screams came again from the schoolhouse, along with gunfire. That was the moment the police figured out the situation and decided to join them. When I blacked out, the creature killed a few more men, with Bob and others escaping luckily. The Mennonites then threw their homemade Molotovs towards the creature, setting it on fire, with it retreating into the cave. The schoolhouse is eventually burned down to block the entrance, trapping the creature down in the cave. I asked him whether he'll tell anyone about it. He explained that everyone knew about it, but that he, along with the people involved, wouldn't tell a soul as it'll get people curious and go to the place, potentially releasing it again. He was also relieved that I somehow survived the whole ordeal, and I have thought about it since. Years later, I am still pondering about that thought. The fire burning in that cavern would have filled it with carbon monoxide, even potentially killing the thing. For some reason, it didn't. Either it was just recently lit, or that the system is much bigger than I could imagine. If it is the latter, who knows how many more of those things are underground, waiting to get out onto the surface. Fourth story, haunted by a hooded shadow figure. I thought I would share a small collection of paranormal experiences I've had over the years, namely 2 specific incidents, both of which were somewhat ongoing for a time. I've always had a bit of what I call a spooky meter. I don't really have any better word for it than that. There have been times I will walk into a room and get a very unsettling feeling, and generally I seem to visually perceive it differently. Things will generally appear darker and dimmer than they ought to, as if light is swallowed. As a bit of an example of my spooky radar going off even in an exterior environment, I'm from Australia and a couple years back traveled to Cairns for work and met up with some people who worked for the same organization in a branch in far north Queensland. One of these whom I spent the most time with happened to be Aboriginal, and in our time off she took me to a few touristy places. One of these went by a rock pool and I instantly got a horrible feeling. Despite the fact that it was a sunny day, the sunlight appeared dull, dim and gray, kind of like that scene from LTR when Frodo and Sam are traversing the mountains at the start of the Two Towers. I remember instinctively I turned to her and said, "This is a bad place." Her eyes lit up and she immediately began telling me that this was an area that had a lot of drownings and that there is an old Aboriginal legend about a male and female from two separate tribes who fell in love, which was for reasons I'm not qualified to speak on, taboo. I'm probably going to butcher the story, so I do apologize, but in short they were both punished and killed by that rock pool, and it's said that her angry spirit remains there and holds anyone that comes there under the water. There's actually a super scary story about one case in which the local news took a photo of the spot after a man drowned there and published it in the newspaper. In the photo, the rocks form the shape of the man's face, which is super creepy. I tried to hunt down the photo, but I can't for the life of me find out, so you'll have to just take my word for it or do your own research. As far as the drownings go, there is actually a scientific reason for this that I'm not familiar with that you can search up if you like. However, Aboriginals have a rich storytelling history. I'm conscious not to misrepresent a rich and fascinating culture that doesn't get enough attention and love in Australia. This is just what I've been taught. I think there's actually some truth in a lot of these, and I know people on here like Wendigo stories. Some indigenous tribes have a version of the Wendigo, although I'm not familiar with it. Sorry for the long-ass foreplay. Time for the story. In my childhood home, which was built by my parents, so not a case of someone died here and haunts it, a fact my unbelieving father regularly tells me even to this day when my siblings and I repeat this story. We had a spare room which always gave me the creeps toward the back of the house at the end of a long hallway. I should also mention we lived on a farm fairly far from town, and on it I've had a number of creepy experiences, but none like the ones I'm going to mention. I should also say my father has lived in the house since his mid-20s along with a few housemates, one of which used to claim that the house was haunted. The only story my non-believing father told me that he couldn't explain was that the stereo system, which was unplugged, began blasting music in the early hours of the morning. Firstly, when I was extremely young, too young perhaps to recall this, but it has been a core memory for me always, I was awoken in my room by something I thought to be my father. I don't remember seeing him or what he looked like, only that I was lifted from my cot and put on the floor. He had large feet and our hallway had a wooden floor. I remember crawling after him and following the imprints from where his barefoot made on the floor until we got to the kitchen. "Let's have ice cream," he said to me. He lifted me to the freezer, which was way too high for me to reach, and I grabbed the ice cream and began to eat it. It was dark at the time, and when the sun began to rise, my dad came back downstairs. I remember him asking me what I was doing and taking the ice cream off me. I told him I was eating the ice cream and that he had taken me to get it. He had absolutely no idea what I was talking about and said he absolutely did not wake me up in the middle of the night to get me some ice cream. When I brought it up with him now as a young adult, he says he remembers it and claims I must have climbed it. There is absolutely no way I could have climbed it. When I was perhaps 4 or 5, I recall playing with my brother and 2 sisters at the end of the hallway opposite the room. We saw a black hooded figure that was blurry and smoky, if you like. Depiction attached at the end of the story. It ran past us at a ridiculous speed and went into the spare room, slamming the door behind it. We all screamed and carried on, and then I guess forgot about it and put it down to being young and overly imaginative. Despite of this, however, we never entered that room if we didn't have to. and would always close the door and or turn the light on in there, only to find the door open and the light off whenever we went back. Could have been our parents. That all changed when I was 12. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, and I had shared a room for our whole childhood. When my brother transitioned to high school, my parents thought it best we have our own rooms as he was staying up later, and I'm sure puberty also played a role. I was moved into the spare room, which as I'd gotten older sort of gotten over my fear of. It was a simple room, fairly small and square. My bed was situated in the bottom left-hand corner of the room. A desk ran along the wall beside it toward the door, in which I mostly used for building Lego. The far left corner had a big-ass wooden wardrobe, which I never used. A window sat on the wall facing the door that never seemed to let enough light in despite its size, and the entire right-hand side of the room was just a giant cupboard with sliding doors. My walls were also covered in posters, which is important to note. I spent anywhere between 2 weeks to a month in hell when I first moved into that room. From the get-go, my spooky radar went pretty haywire, and I didn't really like being in there. I will do my best to recount the incidences that I remember, although there aren't a lot. For reference, I spent every night of that initial month in there unable to sleep and battling all manner of strange occurrences. There are probably like 21 nights worth of scary incidences, most that I can't recall and probably deliberately tried to forget. The first occurrences were fairly tame. I used to have a pedestal fan running most nights that created a pretty heavy white noise. Because of it, I can't really confirm whether what I heard was real or not, but initially I thought I could hear whispering throughout the night. It used to put me super on edge, especially since it was just faint enough that I couldn't discern if I was crazy or not. So already my sleep started getting pretty bad. Then things started to get worse. My floor was carpeted, and I would begin to hear that soft sort of crumpling sound you hear when someone's walking on it. The footsteps were slow, and would always come toward me, and would come from the wardrobe in the corner of the room. Strangely, most things would occur from the wardrobe in the corner. I remember I initially had a lamp in my room, which I would turn on as soon as I heard anything. But after way too short of a time, the bulb blew and the lamp never worked again, no matter how many bulbs we put in it. I transitioned to using my iPod for a light, then with one of those torch apps, and this I always kept at my side. It became necessary for me to sleep facing the door, as every time I did finally get to sleep, if I was facing the wall, I would get a horrific nightmare. Sometimes I would fall asleep facing the door, have a nightmare, and wake up to find that I had rolled over in the night. I began to wake up periodically in the night to strange noises. Things would move around or fall off shelves. This was actually trackable and began to truly confirm my strong suspicions that something was amiss. I'm not Christian, but I am open-minded, and despite my lack of belief, God plays a part in this story. Strangely, I began to wake at 3 a.m., which is known as the witching hour. I didn't know this until I consulted the resident spooky expert of my school, who we will call James for the sake of the story. He was just a kid who had seen way too many horror movies. James told me that my room was likely haunted and that I should try and record it through the night. So I set my iPod up to charge overnight and used a voice recorder app to record the sounds during the night. I tried video first, however my phone would overheat and die too quickly and probably wouldn't have had enough storage space for an 8-hour recording anyway. Old technology wasn't as capable as it is now. But strangely, the recordings would always stop at random intervals, as though someone had pressed stop. I had a passcode, so that was impossible, so those amounted to nothing. Things got worse again. One day I felt as though my duvet was moving, and I didn't think much of it because it used to fall down the side of my bed because of its weight sometimes. This time it felt as though it were rising, and before I could really clock it, a hand touched my back. It wasn't freezing cold like the movies, nor did it burn me at anything like that. It just felt like a human hand planted itself on my back. I recoiled naturally and probably spent the rest of the night with the light on. From then on, I used to tuck my blanket underneath my body, which was a habit I maintained until I was like 18 thanks to that experience. Another time, my blanket felt like it was falling down the bed again, so I grabbed it and went to pull it back, only it didn't move. Initially, I thought it was stuck on something, but no matter how hard I pulled, it didn't move. That's when the blanket was pulled back. I remember my heart fucking raced. I essentially played tug of war with a fucking ghost for 30 seconds before it let up, and I flew backward with the blanket, having been pulling on it with all my strength and going back and forth prior to it. After that, I remember things got borderline awful, and I basically didn't sleep ever. I spoke to James about it and how things seemed to be getting worse, and I was outright terrified now, and he speculated that it may be feeding on my fear and growing stronger with each passing night. This notion obviously horrified me, and I asked him what I could do. He actually suggested I pray, funnily enough, and told me a few things I could say that had worked in some horrors he'd seen. I don't remember the order of operations, but what I do know is that one night things were especially bad. Whispering, objects moving around and falling, strange noises and footsteps. I couldn't take it anymore, and so I prayed. I prayed that I be given the strength and courage to face the thing, and I prayed that whatever was in my room go fuck off back to wherever it came from. I recall this next part perfectly and will likely never forget it. I sat up in my bed and yelled, "In the name of God, I banish you from my room." I remember raising my fist as though I was prepared to fight it with my bare hands. I think MT courage was fueled by the belief that God was on my side. From the corner of my room rushed the same hooded black figure I saw in my childhood. It was like a misty blur. It moved so quickly that it generated a wind that swept across the room as it ran, blowing off all my posters and knocking over the Lego on my desk, which smashed on the floor. It rushed to the exit of my room and stopped in the doorway. I remember it turned and looked at for only about half a second, but what gives me the chills was at the speed it moved. In its time, I dare say it stared a lot longer than that. I remember I fell asleep after that in pure exhaustion, and I slept like a fucking baby. When I woke up, I thought I had imagined or dreamt the whole thing, but when I looked around my room, the thing was fucking trashed. So badly that I remember my dad came in and told me it looked like a hurricane had passed through it. He didn't believe me when I told him what happened. I think he believed that I believed it, but some people, I guess, just have never had an experience and therefore refuse to buy into it whenever someone else tells a story. That's fair enough, I suppose. Nothing happened after that. I never forgot about what occurred, and it even made me a devout Christian for like 12 months. The only thing that occurred involving whatever the thing was came when I was about 15. We had what used to be a toy/play room that got converted into a gym room with a treadmill and bench plus a kid's computer room. I was working out in it one day while my sister was playing on the computer. I remember she looked over my shoulder and screamed. She said she saw a black hooded figure behind me, that it was blurry and hazel like it was made of smoke, and that it was watching me, and that it ran away when she screamed. That was the last I've ever seen it. It's funny though, because a lot of people apparently have seen the cloaked bastard during sleep paralysis. That's how I found the photo below though. But I know I was awake when I saw it, and if you can't believe me, then believe my siblings. I've had some other spooky tales. One that shook me a little bit that's much shorter, that's probably the best example of my spooky radar in action that I may lost. Fifth story. I lived in a small town called Pinestone, and my best friend disappeared when I was 7. There are stories about things that go on in little isolated towns. I've lived in the great northwoods of Michigan for most of my life. I lived in a little town called Pinestone in the Copper Country as a kid. See, towns like Pinestone are pretty isolated. Hell, I'd be surprised if you could even find a map that marked the place. Perhaps that's for the best, though, as I would come to realize as I grew, places like Pinestone should just be forgotten. Growing up in the copper country, you hear all sorts of rumors and myths like the Wendigo, Yellow Mike, Dog Men, but the one that always scared me was the Jaggers. The story says that the town of Pinestone is watched by the Jaggers, a group of people descended from a group of German trappers back when the natives owned the land. They used to hunt elk, deer, moose, bison. You name it, they hunted it until they hunted most of them animals up here to near extinction. It was at that time some say the hunters were cursed to hunt their fellow man. Parents used to tell us kids if we misbehaved, the Jaggers would take us away from them. I never really believed that story until a friend of mine disappeared. Her name was Marlene, but I always called her March. Marlene was a transplant. Her parents were trolls from down below the bridge. I never understood the hatred of those from the lower peninsula. They all seemed nice enough to me, and Marlene was no exception. We had been friends for most of our childhood. That was until we went camping. My dad decided for my birthday to take me and my friend Marlene camping. Now, Dad was a seasoned hunter and fisher, but Marlene's dad insisted he come with us, which my old man agreed, too much to me and Marlene's dismay. I remember the day clearly. We had set up camp in the middle of the forest in a place me and my dad liked camping. I remember me and my father decided to go fishing in the late afternoon on the coast of Lake Superior. It was a mostly peaceful venture aside from accidentally hooking my old man near his eye. I should have looked behind me, and he shouldn't have been behind me, but he got the hook out, and we started back to camp when we heard Marlene scream. I remember running as fast as I could back to the camp, but we were too late. The tents had been torn to shreds, and a trail of blood led into the forest. I never did see Marlene again. The police labeled the event as a cougar attack, but I know the truth. I know why my dad warned me of the Jaggers. I won't lie to you. It's been 20 years since I questioned Marlene's disappearance. I believed the story that a cougar attacked her and her father that day. I moved on after a while. I eventually moved away from Pinestone down to Houghton and eventually married a woman who, for her safety, I won't name, before taking a job on a charter fishing boat. I eventually had my own daughter who, again, I won't name here in case they happen to read this. I didn't think of Marlene until my little girl and I were walking through the forest and she found Marlene's backpack hanging on a tree. I was surprised to see it after all these years, but even more surprised by the fact that it looked just as it did the day she disappeared. I cautiously picked up the backpack and began to open it up, and I was hit with the memories of Marlene. She was my best friend since I was 3, and I had abandoned her after I thought she was dead. In her pack I found a note I gave her that day. I opened it up and saw she had written a response. I asked if she liked me. She wrote she liked me. It's childish, but that made the memories hurt all the more. Then I saw another note, this one newer. I opened it up and was horrified when I read it. She had written this note begging me to find her 12 years ago when I was 15. I don't know why this pack was here, but it's obvious to me these Jaggers had been tracking me ever since that day. They took toys I thought I had lost over the years. They took notes, books held my homework assignments that I thought were lost. They put them all in her backpack along with a final note. Beware, beware the forest at night should you go out and not be right. We come to make sure you never, never leave. The old rhyme my mom used to tell me, so I'd never go out into the forest without her or my dad. I grabbed my daughter and began to run back to the car. I took the backpack with me. If they could fool the cops back, then I have no doubt they'd do it again. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section. And like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.